Hello, Stephen. This is my presentation for the final project in TH505, and the title is The Catholic Church and Abortion. And I chose abortion, I'll go into that in just a second, but not because it's just the most important issue, but rather it's one that is prominent in the lives of both Catholics and non-Catholics, and it is a direct confrontation of Catholic moral theology and the moral values of society in general. The organization of the presentation is obviously we'll take a look at why we're going to discuss this subject. Then we're going to look at where we are now, and by doing that we'll look at the Catechism, the Catholic Church on abortion. It's for most practicing Catholics. The Catechism would be the most accessible description of the Church's stand on abortion. And we'll also look at Evangelium Vitae on abortion, since that is one of the most vital documents and up-to-date documents on the Church's stand on abortion. And I note now that on this slide I've mistyped abortion under where we are. Sorry about that. We're also going to look at where we've been, look at the history. The theology of abortion has changed over time, and while always seen as a sin and an act to be condemned, there has been rather dramatic changes over time in direction regarding the moment the fetus has become a human being, and thus whether it is simply a sin or it's something worse. Is it a mortal sin? Is it homicide, murder? And much back and forth. Of course, during this period, or this long period of time that the Church has looked at abortion, on who is to be punished for that abortion. Is it just the mother, or is it the doctor, or the other provider of the abortion as well? I've never seen anything on the men involved in the pregnancy being punished at all, although I suppose under societal rules, if they committed adultery, that would certainly be something that would be punished outside of the theology of abortion. And finally, we'll look at the present state of abortion in the U.S., that is, what is happening right now. What are they saying? I looked at 4 prominent books on abortion from a secular point of view to see how they address the moral scale of abortion as well. Looking at our very first section, why this subject? Well, abortion has always been one of the most prominent moral issues in the Catholic Church and is now played on a national stage, affecting both Catholics and non-Catholics, like I mentioned earlier. The theology of abortion leads directly to a foundational precept of the Catholic moral theology. Catholic moral theology, it's to love your neighbor as your neighbor. Let me try saying that again, to love your neighbor as yourself. And of course we know that Jesus said this in Matthew 5:43, and he was really quoting Leviticus 19:18 on the precept to love your neighbor as yourself, to not commit murder of any kind. And of course love is the greatest of divine virtues enumerated by St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 13:13, greatest perhaps because it lasts through all eternity. Is not something that is here and then gone. It is with us forever. Not only our capacity to love, but our need for love as well. And most recently it's been made even more topical, if that's possible, by the recent challenge that has been taken up by the Supreme Court, the Mississippi law that appears to have been designed specifically to challenge Roe v. Wade in the Supreme Court, where they disallow any abortion past 15 weeks, which by the argument in the Mississippi case is when a fetus can begin to feel pain. That is, looking up the medical literature on this, there is absolutely no no medical backing of this. This is simply legal and political strategy to get what they want, which is to take it to the Supreme Court. And this directly challenges, of course, the Roe v. Wade 24-week viability rule and the prescription of putting arbitrary barriers in place between a woman seeking an abortion and the availability of abortion services. So we'll see how that turns out. No one really knows at this point. Lots of people are scared on both sides of this on how it will turn out. But that's one reason why I chose this, because it is suddenly even more topical than it was before. And certainly abortion access, just as either a problem or a solution, is as available now as it always has been. Between January and April of 2021, the Guttmacher Institute, which keeps track of these things and is respected by every side to provide reliable numbers, said that state legislatures have enacted 536 abortion restrictions just in those 4 months of 2021. So it's obviously something that is important to everyone now, just as it has been in the past. Going on to the next section, the current state of the theology of abortion, and we'll look at the Catechism and Evangelium Vitae to explicate our current state. The Catechism, of course, its references range from biblical passages written more than 2.5 millennia ago, and so it provides a thread, an argument that is sustained throughout church history. One reason why the Catechism is so important. It ranges from biblical passages written more than 2.5 millennia ago to a speech Pope Francis gave in 2017 as the footnotes for the 50 paragraphs in the Catechism that address abortion. It goes from Genesis to Isaiah, written 700 years before the life of Christ, to Matthew, written a mere 1900 years ago. The references go from the Didache of the 1st century to St. Augustine in the 5th century, to Aquinas in the 13th century, and all the way to, like I said before, to Pope Francis just a few years ago. So we have a coherent message that lasts for centuries and centuries. Over the course of just 50 short paragraphs, it presents a unified and coherent and humane explanation of the Church's theology of a human being. And it presents the baseline argument of the Church on the evil of abortion. The Catechism tells the reader that we're all God's children from the moment of conception, and that each of us, no matter where we are in the stage of life, from conception to the end of life, that we enjoy all the rights and privileges of any person, all of whom possess the divine seed, all of whom are God's creatures. The Catechism presents its judgment of abortion as unchangeable and timeless, a principle that emerges from our most primitive impulses as creatures, infused with truths which God imbues on us all. However, the Church's reaction to abortion has changed through time as opinions on when fetuses are animated and or are ensouled, another way of putting the same thing, changes. And we'll return to how those views change over time in just a minute or so. And we can also look at Evangelium Vitae from 1995. Pope John Paul II's encyclical is a counterattack on the threats to life and against the spread of what he calls, and what many critics have called, the culture of death, one that looks at easy ways to end difficult lives and to end what is seen as a problematic pregnancy before birth. The encyclical, which was published on March 25, 1995, pursues a twofold goal. First, it vigorously defends human life by solemnly condemning abortion and euthanasia and suicide, and all of which directly violate the precept, you shall not kill, whether it's yourself or somebody else. It denounces in our societies the dangers of a culture of death, like I mentioned, against which we must fight on the personal, social, political, and legislative levels, even to the point of conscientious objection. If this becomes necessary to do, then we will conscientiously object and demonstrate. The second goal of the encyclical is to promote a culture of life as opposed to that culture of death, especially on the level of the family, which it calls the sanctuary of life, that forms the basic unit of society and the great family that is the church. And I got that from Pinker's on page 61 and 62, just on the by and by. It is as well an invitation to its audience to celebrate each precious life through offering respect and protection and love to each person, to every human being. The reward to this kind of extension is justice and development of one's own spiritual life, the true freedom that religion can offer, peace and happiness as well, rather than what is at the core of abortion, which the church tells us is torture and mutilation and, of course, euthanasia. Pope John Paul tells us that all of these acts are a yearning for nothingness. It's a rupture at the heart of the inclination to preserve a human being. And that's recorded also in Pinker's on page 103. John Paul II argues that rejecting the Church's teaching on contraception makes the argument supporting abortion even stronger. They're both evils, but they're different kinds of evils. Contraception contradicts the full truth of the sexual act and is opposed to the virtue of chastity, both of those which are important values in Catholic moral theology. Abortion, on the other hand, destroys the life of a human being, an actual human being, not just a fetus or an embryo, and is opposed to the virtue of justice and violates the divine commandment of "you shall not kill." Moving on to where we've been, the history of the Church, and for this I rely almost entirely on Joseph Connery's magisterial work, The History in Abortion, the Development of the Roman Catholic Perspective, which is not in print, but the Wellahan Library at St. Joseph's sent me a copy through interlibrary loan. Bless their hearts. The Christian tradition from the earliest days reveals a firm anti-abortion attitude. There's no reason to believe that this was a Christian innovation. Strong evidence points to a continuity between this attitude and that of the Jews, especially the early Jewish communities of pre-Christian times. But it contrasts markedly with the attitude and practice of the Roman world, with the frequency of abortion and particularly of infanticide, which has been noted even by pagan writers. Exodus 20:13 provides a new instruction for all of us not to take innocent life. This, of course, is a change from what I just mentioned. Since humans are created in God's image, as Genesis 1:26 tells us, killing an innocent person is tantamount to killing God in effigy. Abortion is consistently condemned. Paul's condemnation in Galatians of what seemed to be an abortion seemed to be abortion-inducing drugs in his denouncement of pharmakia. The Didache also condemns abortion, as does Clement of Alexandria in the 3rd century. Tertullian, of course, in the 2nd century, equated abortion with Roman ritual sacrifice. And St. Augustine, of course, also condemns it. And, of course, there are many more examples throughout this early period. The early condemnations of abortions were generally associated with similar condemnations of infanticide, an indication that in the minds of the early Christians, the two were closely related. The condemnation of abortion did not depend on and was not limited in any way by theories regarding the time of fetal animation. Even during the many centuries when church penal and penitential practice was based on the theory of delayed animation, the condemnation of abortion was never affected by it. Whatever one would want to hold about the time of animation, or when the fetus became a human being in the strict sense of the term, abortion from the time of conception was considered wrong, and the time of animation was never looked on as a moral dividing line between permissible and immoral abortion. As long as what was aborted was destined to be a human being, it made no difference whether the abortion was induced before or after it became so. The final result was always the same. A child was not born. The current debate regarding abortion departs from the past in this respect. Many of those who argue in favor of abortion make the primary issue of when the fetus becomes a human being. If the fetus is not yet a man or a woman, or a human being or a person, or whatever terminology is used, it is entitled to less consideration. For many, the time of humanization is the general dividing line between the moral and immoral abortion. In the Christian tradition, the distinction between the formed and unformed fetus, or we can call it the animated and unanimated fetus, played no more than a secondary role, at least in reference to abortion. That distinction was mainly used for purposes of legal classification and the grading of penances relative to the reconciliation of sinners. By the 7th century, someone participating in an abortion spent 1 year in penance for aborting a fetus less than 40 days old, 40 days after gestation, I should say, and 3 years for abortions that were done after 40 days of gestation. And this follows the old Aristotelian notion of when a fetus becomes a human being. Although the question of when life begins, or when human life begins, did not play a decisive role in determining the morality of abortion, it was of great interest to the ancients. What seems to be the more primitive approach held that the fetus did not become a human being until it was born. This was the judgment of the Jews in early biblical times. Before it was born, the fetus was considered to be part of the mother, and its development was explained in this way. Aristotle thought, like I mentioned, the human soul was not infused until the fetus was formed in the mother, and this occurs 40 days in the male fetus and 90 days in the female fetus. Influenced by Aristotle, even Aquinas held a similar view of when the fetus became ensouled, or when it became a human being. The fetus, according to Aristotle and to his followers, before it was formed, had initially a vegetative soul and then a sensitive soul. But not everyone accepted this succession of souls as it moves through these various soul states. Some simply held that before the human soul was infused, the fetus was part of the mother, and an organ like any other organ, that if it became diseased or if it became a problem, you simply took that organ out. But there were a number of early fathers who held the human soul was present right from the very beginning. It was not until the 14th century that the distinction between the formed and unformed, or animated and unanimated, fetus was used as a basis for an exception to the general condemnation of abortion. A Dominican theologian, John of Naples, in the 14th century, was the first to allow abortion of an unanimated fetus if necessary to save the mother's life. The basic reason for the allowance was precisely the fact that the unanimated fetus was not yet a human being. Some later authors question whether he was really advocating induced abortion or merely allowing a treatment aimed at curing some maternal ailment, and thus the double effect rule that Aquinas created came into play here, where the intention was not to harm the fetus, the intention was to fix whatever problem was occurring in the mother, and the death of the fetus was simply an unexpected effect, unintended. The exception made by John of Naples had a respectable following, but it also met with opposition. The opposition emerged with the general acceptance of immediate animation. The whole issue of aborting the unanimated fetus to save the mother's life became obsolete if the fetus was animated or became a human being at conception. The argument was based on the need for a formative principle in the embryo right after conception, something that guided the formation and represented the potentiality of a fully functioning human being in the fetus itself. After ruling out other possibilities, one theologian named Fiennes concluded that this had to be a soul, this impetus, this guiding. it also had to be the same soul that was present in the fetus at the end of the developing process, since his succession of souls made no sense to this particular theologian named Fiennes. Even so, it took another century to be accepted because, of course, church practices were hard to change, like changing the course of a battleship. It's hard to move this large object to a different direction. The opinion met initially with considerable opposition, but in the course of the next several centuries replaced the theory of delayed animation as the common opinion. It was accepted in church practice in 1869 when Pius IX, in Apostolicae Sedis, removed the limitations on excommunications for abortions by removing the distinction between an animated and unanimated fetus from penal legislation. The idea of immediate animation and thus immediate ensoulment was facilitated by Pius IX's Ineffabilis Deus in 1854, which established the dogma of Mary's Immaculate Conception. Curiously enough, the Church today finds itself in a position quite similar to the one which prevailed at the beginning of the Christian era. In those days, it was surrounded by a society in which abortion and infanticide was practiced frequently. For the first 150 years of its existence, the Church had no support from the civil law in combating this evil, and during the next 1800 years, the support was provided in the form of laws penalizing abortion. And let me add that Ineffabilis Deus, establishing Mary's Immaculate Conception, meant that from her moment of conception, she was a human being, and thus made it much more difficult to argue that there was a delayed animation, a delayed time when a fetus became a human being. At the end of the 19th century, the globe had pretty much eradicated abortion. Today, the trend has been reversed. The movement of the Western world is towards liberalizing abortion legislation. In the U.S., laws protecting the fetus against abortion decisions by the mother have actually been declared unconstitutional. And in our present society, the frequency of abortion is far greater than anything the Romans or ancient world ever knew or dreamed of. The early church, together with the Jews, was able to present a common front against abortion in the pagan world. And the question now is, can a divided Christianity repeat the performance of the early church? And certainly we have a decline in the number of abortions, the frequency of abortions in the U.S., and we'll see what has to happen, what will happen with this latest challenge. Now let's move on to what are they saying? What are the people that discuss abortion say about abortion? This falls into the category of the present discourse on abortion. I take this quote from a book that I discovered when I was chasing down the quote that you offered on whorehouses and searching for God. This comes from Bruce Marshall's The World, the Flesh, and Father Smith. When one considered the bitterness and the hatred in men's hearts today, one is tempted to conclude that the Church of God has failed. That is the quote from the novel. At first blush, this seems like a bleak assessment of the place of the church in contemporary culture. But Marshall goes on to say that it was perhaps the preachers who had failed. Perhaps the truth has been too big for them and had ridden clumsily on their lips. And certainly his assessment might be part of an answer to the pro-abortion text I looked through. That's simply the argument that the church makes in its theology is simply too abstract or too distant from current cultural practices to make much sense. I did look at 4 books, secular books that talk about the issue of abortion, and none of these 4 texts really examines the morality of abortion, as has Catholic moral theology. All 4 assume that morality favors the woman, her personal desires for the outcome of her pregnancy, her choice on whether her pregnancy should be interfered with, and with that whether that pregnancy interferes with her life choices, and so does not need to be specifically addressed. Maybe all that's assumed and doesn't need to be revisited. As you can see by the quotes under each title, these books sometimes get the history wrong. Organized religion was interested in abortion before the late 50s, 1960s, and the Catholic Church, going all the way back to the time of Christ, certainly was interested in abortion. You can see under Gloria Feltz, a quote, "Even in religions where abortions were generally forbidden, almost all are to some extent pro-choice," and what she's talking about are the exceptions, like the exception in the Catholic Church for a diseased uterus or an ectopic pregnancy in which the fetus is going to die anyway before it's not going to be born alive, and so by treating the diseased uterus or the fallopian tube that has been compromised, the death of the fetus is only a secondary effect, and so it fits under the rule of double effect, and those are the only two exceptions. And Felt, who works for Planned Parenthood, is an advocate for Planned Parenthood, chooses to interpret that as pro-choice. And we can see in Christina Page's book, she works for NARAL, on the by and by, is the pro-choice movement that has helped construct and that now defends our dearest values, when what she's talking about is our independence, our individual rights that should be protected in this case. And Hull, as the editor of the book on abortion rights in America, frames the entire investigation into Catholic moral theology as being an intrusion into the prerogatives of government, and if we were to adopt any of the values of Catholic moral theology, we are simply substituting secular ethics with a state theology, which of course is something that is anathema to United States civic values. When I read those, I thought of this quote from Flannery O'Connor, that these people are a generation of wingless chickens with the moral sense bred out. And of course she was talking about reviewers of her book who didn't see the sense of God in it and were simply reacting to what they thought was more Southern Gothic grotesqueries. They just didn't understand, and that's how she wrote that. And that occurred to me as I'm reading this of the books on abortion. Let me end this, and this is much longer than I expected it to be, 27 minutes I'm at right now. I apologize for the length. Widespread public opinion feels that it is exaggerated and inopportune and downright distasteful for the Church to remind contemporary society about the issue of conceived and unborn human life as a decisive action. A decisive question, let me say. Why not recognize, in the light of what has occurred in almost all Western cultures, that we have lost the battle and that it would be better to dedicate our energies to issues that can find support in a broader social consensus? After all, no one is forced to have an abortion. All remain free to act according to their own conscience on this very disputed issue. However, I would like to mention Genesis 9:5 and 6. "Indeed, for your own lifeblood, I will demand an accounting. From every animal I will demand it, and from a human being, each one for the blood of another, I will demand an accounting for human life. Anyone who sheds the blood of a human being by a human being shall that one's blood be shed. For in the image of God have human beings been made." God claims the life of a human being as God's own possession under God's direct and immediate protection. As a result, the respect of every human life is an essential condition for every truly human society. When humanity loses respect for life as sacred, humanity itself loses its own identity. We must not give up the fight, says Charles Curran on page 121 of his book. Here is the bibliography for the book. I will send the PDF file of the presentation to you, and of course you've seen this on YouTube. Here's the other part of the bibliography for this course, and I just want to say thank you for listening. And I hope this wasn't too long, and thanks for the course.